All right. It's Tuesday, which means it is time for another edition of Pastor Reacts. All right. Just getting everything set up here. Second stream of the day. Hopefully everybody's day is going well. I had a pretty good turnout this morning. So hopefully we get a similar turnout this evening. Cool. So, if you are new to the Tuesday evening live stream, this one is a bit more a little bit more open. There's a theme, but it's open to conversation and discourse and all of that sort of jazz. This one's a little bit different. So the last couple I've been reacting to something specific, but this one is a little bit more general. So for those of you that don't know, I have a channel called Thoughts from a Bearded Geek. And over on Thoughts from a Bearded Geek, we talk about a lot of things across geek culture, a lot of things, movies, comics, all kinds of stuff. And there has been a lot of discourse from all sides over the last several weeks, really, about a couple of movies. And I've had some people that have reached out to me that have seen some of the stuff that I've been putting out there and have had a fair bit to question and ask as far as being a pastor and engaging with this media. And so I'm going to talk about it. So one of the big pressing questions that I tend to get is how can you be a pastor and engage with stuff like horror movies or engage with different forms of media? Isn't that a problem? If it's not Christian, what about music? All of that sort of jazz. So the big thing that the big thing that I focus on whenever I am considering whether or not something is cool, not cool, whether or not something should be engaged with or not be engaged with, different things like that, is what does that do? What does it do to the individual, right? Because all of this stuff, when you're considering whether or not you should be engaging with something, or whether or not you should be listening to a kind of music or watching a kind of thing, or whatever the case may be, if within the realm of reason, there are certain things that as Christians we don't need to be messing around with. But like we're talking about, this is stuff that very much crosses that threshold, crosses that line. Now, if we're just talking about like run of the mill, whatever, like run of the mill movies, TV shows, what have you, then it becomes a conversation about what are we doing in regards to 1 second. I Okay. Um so it becomes a question of, where does it sit at the individual level? Where does it sit for the person, for the individual, rather than looking at it as some sort of wide angle, widespread sort of edict. And I know that that's kind of hard sometimes to wrap our minds around, because it's a lot easier to answer the question of what should I it's a lot easier to answer those kinds of things with sweeping statements or overarching um or overarching concepts. But the reality is, when we're talking about media, we have to ask ourselves, what is this doing for me? What is this doing for me in my heart? And then also, I do, Kylie. I do read the chat. Um, so this, what's this doing for me? And then, on a one-on-one basis, investigate whether or not that's right for you. And if it is, go in peace. And and I'll take it a step further, right? I fundamentally believe that we can learn a lot and have really insightful conversations through the lens of geek culture, movies, music, different things like that, if we broaden our perspective outside of just the singular mindset of it all has to be Christian, it all has to be XYZ. And that's one of the things, like, what even constitutes Christian media? Does it have to be does it have to come from a label? Now, what happens if it comes from a label, but the theology is shot as far as that goes? You understand what I mean? It's a weird spot to be in when you're hyper focused on the idea that it has to look a certain way, it has to be a certain way, and all of that. What about bigger wide angle questions? What about bigger wide angle aspects of the conversation? So, like, I'll take an example of what I'm talking about as far as plumbing deeper depths of different things, as by way of, like, pop media and stuff like that. I just got done reading a book called The Philosophy in Star Wars, and it goes through each one of the episodes of Star Wars as well as connected media. And it's basically like a buffet of different philosophical concepts that are found within Star Wars, addressing the different characters, different plot points, different overarching themes, things like that. It doesn't go like super deep. Like, anybody who's an expert in philosophy would probably find it lacking, but it is an interesting read in the way that it kind of presents a wide angle view of like some of the motivations of some of the characters within Star Wars. And it even went as far as to compare the idea of faith in God with the idea of good and evil as it's presented in Star Wars, and the idea of the Force and reliance on the Force and belief in the Force and all of that sort of stuff. And I thought it was compelling, right? Because the more that we understand humans, I think the better we are to be equipped to be able to engage with the world around us. And that's really what this comes down to, right? When we are living this life, it is okay that we enjoy things. It is okay that we enjoy movies. It is okay that we enjoy TV shows. It is okay that we enjoy comedy. It is okay that we enjoy music. It is okay that we enjoy these things. And we are also in the midst of the world and humanity. And so engaging with these things can oftentimes give us a better insight to be able to engage with the people that are around us and ask big questions. Because I think, unfortunately, we get scared to ask big questions and to ask and explore concepts outside of a very distinct worldview and point of view. You know what I mean? And I think it's a healthy exercise to start to explore these different concepts that are found within storytelling as a lens to look at yourself and to look at the world around you and to look at people and to look at why you enjoy the things that you enjoy. I thought it was fascinating in this book when it's breaking down the prequel trilogy for Star Wars, and it gets to Anakin, and it's talking about the nuances of the Jedi Council and the highs and lows of what they did and how they acted and how that affected Anakin and all of that sort of stuff. I think it was fascinating, especially as somebody who's trained in mental health, to hear philosophers break down the point of view of this guy that had all of this pressure on him as the chosen one and all of that, and what that does to an individual. um and then dealing with grief and loss and different things like that. And then you have the other big sci-fi franchise in Star Trek has been asking big questions literally from the get, right? The idea since it debuted in 1966 is that it was more than just a run of the mill science fiction series, which the landscape of science fiction in the 60s looked way different than it looks like now. It was meant to serve as this platform for philosophical inquiry, social commentary, ethical exploration, set in a utopian future where humanity has overcome war, poverty, and discrimination, and presents a vision of what we could be, grounded in reason and cooperation and curiosity. That being said, I align with many of the folks that had particular opinions on Gene Roddenberry's take on Star Trek, that was some of the most boring sci-fi storytelling that you had, because it was unrealistic. It was unrealistic to say there was never any more conflict. We overcame conflict entirely, taking the human nature out of it and distinctly putting that on the shoulders of um external forces outside of ourselves, outside of humanity, and things like that. Now, to shift gears to the Christian perspective, there's a fine line between total depravity and human nature. There's a fine line between just looking at things and saying, oh, okay, I'm going to fall into scumbag theology, meaning without God, I am a teetotal scumbag. And that's going to be the sum total of my existence. But the reality is Gene Roddenberry tried to present utopia as if humans at their core are in and of themselves actually perfect and good and reasonable, and it's extenuating circumstances that wreck that or ruin that. And that's why you see, once Gene Roddenberry left and got sick, left, and then ultimately passed away and was no longer involved in the show, that the tone shift happened from optimism into, again, philosophical inquiry. And the idea was that a lot of science fiction was dystopian in nature. Star Trek, the original series, offered an optimistic belief in humanity's potential to solve its own problems through empathy, diplomacy, and exploration. The famous opening monologue, to boldly go where no one has gone before, wasn't just about space travel, it was about moral and intellectual frontiers. And it commonly engaged in moral philosophy, with episodes structured around thought experiences, where or experiments, where you commonly had questions of utilitarianism, deontology, different things like that. Captain Kirk often grappled with whether the ends justified the means, while Captain Picard leaned more toward duty and principle, even when it leads to sacrifice. And then you have the Jedi Code versus the Prime Directive. One of the most philosophically rich ideas in Star Trek is the Prime Directive. Basically, it's a rule prohibiting interference in less developed civilizations. The idea being that you you aren't supposed to step into the affairs of other people, of other civilizations that aren't as developed, because you will alter the course of their development. You will alter the course of how they are going to advance as a society. And a lot of times it raised deep questions about cultural relativism, paternalism, ethics, different things like that. And then you get into artificial intelligence and personhood with characters like Data in The Next Generation and the Doctor in Voyager that challenge viewers to reconsider what it means to be a person. Do sentience and self awareness make one deserving of rights? And in a world that is advancing in technology, what do we draw the line, or where do we draw the line as to what qualifies as sentience and being self aware? There is a whole episode in TNG that is centered around asking the question of whether or not Data is a person, or if Data should just be subject to a Federation officer being able to take him and basically take him apart and be able to study his matrix and to be able to study what makes him him and be able to basically recreate him. And the argument of the Federation officer was that it's just a robot. It's just basically a computer on two legs. And computers don't have the same rights as humanity, where Captain Picard was advocating for the fact that Data was self aware enough that he deserved the rights and privileges of being a human. And then you can take that even deeper. Well, what does it mean to give somebody unalienable right? What does it mean to respect somebody at an inherently human level? Now, see, that's a very Christian idea. It's not necessarily specifically just a Christian idea, because there are many people that would argue that that's a very human idea, and it is a human idea. But there is a flavor of that within Christianity when we start to look at the idea of what makes a person a person. Well, a person is an image bearer. Regardless of whether or not they're a believer or not, they are an image bearer. They are inherently loved and valued and cherished by God, and by fault, or by way of being an image bearer of God inherently, they deserve respect and care. You see what I mean? We've suddenly found ourselves in a very reasonable conversation to be having within the Christian paradigm. But we got there by way of geek culture. We got there by way of something outside of just boilerplate. And that's really like, okay, so let's extrapolate out the thought process here for a second. If we really cannot engage with these things in an effort that reflects God, does that mean that God is just too small? Does it just mean that God's absent from these different stories? That he's just so small that he can't be addressed in conversations about science fiction? or superheroes or sci-fi or any of these sorts of things. And then that's where I get into the conversation about the horror genre. And that's where, like, I think sometimes when we look at fantasy, especially high fantasy, that's easier for us to wrap our minds around. And namely because some of the tentpole um voices in when it comes to fantasy writing had some kind of intrinsic tie to Christianity, and thus it's easier for us to wrap our mind around what all of that looks like. Also, fantasy tends to have a more clear cut good versus evil sort of dynamic to it, and that's where I think something like Star Wars can be easier to wrap our minds around than Star Trek. Because while Star Wars looks outward to explore the cosmos through reason and diplomacy, Star Wars turns inward and looks at the mythic journey through the human soul. It looks at a more classical idea of good versus evil. And with fantasy, with something like Lord of the Rings, it's not hard to see who the good guys are and who the bad guys are, who the heroes are and who the villains are. And a lot of times that becomes a lot easier of a conversation to have when we've wrapped our mind around good versus evil, right versus wrong, hero versus villain. But I ask you this question: how often, when we look at the world around us, is life that clear cut? How often, when we look at the dimensions of good versus evil, is life that clear cut? Because for many of us, all we see when we look around is shades of gray, moral flexibility, and different perspectives that dictate what is moral and what is not. And out of that, asking questions of human agency and worth and dignity. See, at the heart of these stories, we're following somebody. We're following somebody that we can put ourselves in their shoes and go through the journey. Whether it's Frodo or Samwise or Gandalf or Aragorn or any of those characters, and I'm not even that big of a fan of Lord of the Rings, and I'm pretty sure I got all of those names right. So awesome! Or the kids in Narnia, right? The Pevensey children in Narnia, and we're going through and we're battling the White Witch, and we're battling these different opposing forces, and we're battling Tash and all of that. Can you tell I'm more of a Narnia fan? And we're going through and following this journey as it's playing out, and eventually reaching this point where good has overcome and won the day. Though I will say with Narnia, it's a little bit different. It's a little bit more complex than just a straightforward good versus evil sort of dynamic, but it still begs question um it still begs big questions. It still invites you into asking huge questions about life, right? So, like Narnia, I'll take Narnia for instance. That tends to be one of the most closely tied ones to the Christian faith, namely because of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which is not an allegory. For as much as people think it's an allegory, it is not an allegory. Now, Lewis was a staunch advocate for moral realism, the belief that good and evil are objective truths and not subjective preferences. And so in Narnia, morality is woven into the fabric of the world with the deep magic, the ancient law of Narnia, pointing to a moral order that even Aslan cannot break, right? Right and wrong are not up for negotiation. They are real and binding and cosmic. And that's why we see characters' moral growth. Edmund's betrayal and betrayal and redemption illustrate how evil is not just bad behavior, but a distortion of reality, a distortion of desire. His transformation reveals the reality of conscience and guilt and forgiveness and restoration, and it invites readers to believe that virtue is not arbitrary, but part of a very structure of reality, a very one of the core tenets and tent poles of reality itself. And if you break it, you risk reality as a whole. Now, it's not exactly hard to see where the spiritual symbolism lies with something like Narnia. Now, I said that Narnia is not an allegory, right? Because Lewis flat out rejected the term allegory. He preferred supposition, a supposal. The books are meant to they're meant to position the reader to say, suppose that, enter, fill in the blank. So one example is, suppose that Christ existed in other worlds, other dimensions, that our dimension is a one of many to the rest of the world around us. And so what if Jesus took the form of a lion in this other world? And it's not a one-to-one allegory for Jesus, but a Christ figure, right? His death and resurrection being the biggest tentpole items for the comparison between Aslan and the Christ. That's supposed to reflect the heart of Christian theology: atonement, sacrificial love, triumph over death, stuff like that. But it goes deeper than that. It's this idea of spiritual longing and joy. Lewis often spoke about a deep, inborn yearning that every person is born with. And so when he wrote Narnia, he wrote it in a way that stirs this longing in both characters and readers, a yearning for something deeper, for a deeper world, for a truer home. And then you get into the whole idea of heaven and the new creation, with the last battle portraying the end of Narnia as a gateway to something realer and richer, further up and further in, as it says. And that echoes aspects of popular Christian eschatology, as well as Plato's theory of forms. The idea that this world is a shadow of something greater. Um, and then you have the ideas of free will, right? Free will, temptation, responsibility. Lucy shows unwavering trust. Edmund succumbs to pride and gluttony, yet is later changed by the by the act of repentance and grace, where you have Jadis, the White Witch, who's a symbol of unchecked will and manipulation. She reveals what happens when power is used without humility or love. And then he links faith to childlikeness, and then the whole idea of skepticism versus faith and things like that. Whereas at the heart of the Lord of the Rings is a question as old as philosophy itself: what happens to the soul when it seeks power? The ring's a metaphor. The one ring doesn't just grant power, it corrupts the desire for power. And it's this idea of the seduction of the good, noble characters being tempted by this immutable force of nature, and this idea of the renunciation of that of what am I trying to say? Renunciation as strength. That Characters demonstrate that true strength often lies with humility and not conquest. And Tolkien walks this delicate line between fate and free will, providence, small hands moving the world, and then you get into the role of Gollum. Frodo's mercy to Gollum being one of the most important acts in the series, an ethical decision that unknowingly fulfills a providential purpose. And unlike modern superheroes, Tolkien's heroes are often quiet and reluctant and wound. His moral framework is virtue ethics, where characters matter more than the outcomes themselves. And that's where we see these characters sit in the long term with Frodo and Sam and Aragorn, with Aragorn's kingship, right? He earns the crown not through conquest, but by self denial and service. He waits patiently, he heals the wounded, and he leads with wisdom. And one of Tolkien's most profound philosophical concerns is death, not as a curse, but as a mystery. And that's where I find that this is interesting, right? So y'all saw the name of this one, that it's Pastor reacts to Sinners and Final Destination and other things. Now it's almost easy, as much as Gene Roddenberry sat at this level of true humanity is unlocked when you've discredited religion. But the reality is that was only Gene Roddenberry's vision, and further into the Star Trek world, you start to get the exploration of different societies with faith structures, different societies that do have a belief in something, that do believe in something bigger and deeper and richer than themselves. And as they go through and are exploring these different civilizations and things like that, they find groups that have that have religious belief, that have gods, that believe in different things. And some of them, sometimes it's shown to be a society that doesn't understand something, and so they turn it into a religious system. And then you have others that have creatures among them or have some kind of power that truly is otherworldly. I'm brought to Star Trek DS9, where you've got the prophets, the as Captain Sisko calls them, the wormhole aliens, where they seem to be matter manipulators. They seem to be able to uh, mess with the very fabric of reality. And so there are plenty of examples of an embrace of a religious or faith-based system within these worlds. And I think with that, it becomes a lot easier to, and a lot more palatable to wrap our mind around what all of this looks like, and this being a mirror to ask big and real questions. Well, what happens if we change the script, and instead of looking at science or exploration or philosophy as the means for us to be able to ask big questions and things like that, well, what happens if we instead turn to fear as the means to ask those big questions? So I've been doing a lot of work on Thoughts from Bearded Geek. And so those of you that have joined since the very beginning of this live stream, a lot of this and a lot of the reason why I'm talking about all of this stuff is because of the work and the videos that I've been putting out on Thoughts from a Bearded Geek. I am a longtime horror fan. Let's see if I can do this. Oh, really? It's both of them. So I get it right either way. So both of them, if you look at the stuff behind me, yes, that's a nativity scene with a TARDIS. That's Freddy Krueger. That's Godzilla. That is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I have a channel about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and that was the one that wasn't on the tip of my tongue. That's fascinating. And then that is the poster for Nightmare on Elm Street. Nightmare on Elm Street being the first horror movie that I ever saw, albeit too young. I as I've gotten older and as a pastor and as a grown man, I can say I saw that movie too young. There is in fact an upper bound limit. I'm not saying that this should be an ever loving freak out free for all, but I'm a longtime horror fan. And I have been doing a lot of work within the world of horror because there's a lot of horror movies that are coming out right now. There's a lot of stuff that's really good that's coming out, and one of them is a legacy sequel to the 2000 movie Final Destination. Now, even if you've never seen Final Destination, if you are of the millennial age bracket and you've ever wondered why there is a whole generation, a whole crop of people that absolutely refuse to drive behind a log truck, it's because of Final Destination. If you've never seen Final Destination 2, and you value the ability to be able to drive behind log trucks, don't watch that movie because it will give you trauma. That being said, it is a window to ask huge questions about fatalism, death, and the illusion of control. The franchise might be known for its elaborate death scenes and suspense driven plots, but beneath the gore lies a chilling and persistent philosophical theme. You can't cheat the Reaper. And unlike some of the other windows to asking questions that might be a little bit more optimistic or a lot more redemptive, Final Destination delivers a world that's, I don't know, governed by deterministic rules and invisible forces and cosmic plans that are utterly inescapable. Now, if you look around to the Christian world, there are plenty of people who would fundamentally subscribe to a deterministic sort of perspective, a deterministic sort of point of view. And that's what is at the heart and soul of Final Destination determinism, the belief that all events are casually determined by an unbroken chain of prior occurrences. In this case, the chain is set in motion by death itself, not portrayed by a character, but as an unseen force or basically a law of nature. And so the idea is that somebody has a premonition, cheats the Reaper, gets a whole bunch of people safe, and then death starts coming for them one by one by one. And it is honestly, when you look at postmodern and post-Christian horror, so horror movies that are taking place in basically in the 90s, where it's kind of that rubber band away from the propriety of the 80s and early 90s and the purity movement and all of that sort of stuff into this post ethics postmodern world where it's pushing away from what is culturally normative and going into the world of counterculture and essentially laughing in the face of something spiritual or something existential from yourself, that it's looking at the idea of humanity being the sum total of the human experience. It is essentially right at the top of that list of cynical and postmodern takes on on horror and on looking at big questions through the lens of fear and through the lens of inevitability, where you are looking at this idea of death's list, no escape, attempts to outsmart the system, relocation, substitution, rebirth, they all ultimately fail. The franchise repeatedly asserts that fate cannot be truly altered, only temporarily dodged. And each film emphasizes the complexity and unpredictability of life's chain of events. A dripping cup, a loose screw, a gust of wind. Each tiny event can trigger a cascade leading to death. Chaos theory, cause and effect, the butterfly effect. The series is a macabre illustration of chaos theory where small, seemingly insignificant details set off massive consequences with mechanical precision. It's not random. And oftentimes they're portrayed through Rube Goldberg machines of inevitability. For those of you that don't know, it is a very complex machine that's designed to do 100 different things all in route to do to perform a very simple task. And so each one of the death scenes is huge and elaborate and all of that sort of stuff, all in route of just doing something that is very singular in nature. And this is a series that went on for about 10 years. The first one came out in 2000, which is fascinating because the first one starts off with a plane wreck, and that movie's not getting made a year later. But the central theme of the franchise is an illusion of control. The characters, they tend to think that they are in control and at some point have beaten death, and they are just proven powerless. And unlike stories with clear good and evil dynamics, Final Destination exists in a morally neutral universe. Death isn't hot at our characters. It's nothing personal. It's nothing judgmental. It's not even vengeful. It is inevitable. And characters aren't being punished for their sins. Good people die just like bad people die. It's impartial. And it's a look at randomness versus system. Now, all of that is a dour, all of that's a sad note, all of that's a down look, and all of this sort of thing. But when we honestly and truthfully and realistically look at the nature of the world, what did I say before? This world, friends, for as much as I wish that this wasn't the case, for as much as I wish that this was not the way that it was, for as much as I wish that I could tell you something other than this, I cannot tell you anything other than the fact that the world is nothing but shades of gray. That's what makes God so beautiful. And as a pastor, I can celebrate that. I can love that because I can look at it and say, this is a reflection of the fears of the time. For those of us that were growing up during that time, for those of us that were teenagers at that time when this movie came out, we are a generation that is very accustomed to nihilism, to existentialism, especially somebody like me, because I bridge the gap between Gen X and millennial. I'm half in one and half in the other. And so I'm very well aware of both sides of this argument. And so, again, if we open ourselves up, now, mind you, there are some folks with a mindset that cannot handle the idea of going through a systematic approach to death like this. And if that's something that does something weird to your soul or does something weird to your mind and puts you in a bad headspace and all of that sort of stuff, then don't do it. Go in peace, man. Like, there's no problem. Like, if you can't handle that, then don't do it. Or if the gore is something that doesn't settle well with you and all of that sort of stuff, then go in peace. Okay. Like, this isn't to say that you need to be watching these movies, but opening your mind to the idea of looking past paradigms that are labeled by a specific system that is ultimately meant to generate money and nothing else, that then the world is your oyster to be able to take different things and grow from different things and learn from different things and take different concepts and be able to and to be able to take something out from them. And so I go to this movie that is really at the tip of horror right now, and cinema, and even Christian thought and all of this sort of stuff. This movie Sinners, Michael B. Jordan's newest flick. He plays twins, and I'm not a huge Michael B. Jordan fan. I am one of those guys that, so I put him and Tom Cruise in the exact same category. Tom Cruise, every single time that I see Tom Cruise in a movie, I do not see whatever character he is playing. I see Tom Cruise trying to play a character. And it's the same idea with Michael B. Jordan. I see him trying to play a role. And this is the first one that really took me out of the position of just watching a movie and got me immersed in what was happening on screen. And I, for one, am I am one that has been championing the idea of original stories needing to make a comeback. Now, don't get me wrong, right? I've got all around me in different places different superhero merch, I'm just as much, I am a through and through DC guy. I love DC comics. The Flash, that's my dude. Superman, love him too. I think they have the best heroes. I think they have the best villains. I think they tell the best stories. I love the larger than life nature, but I'm also going to be honest about the fact that, like, dude, I remember when we couldn't beg, borrow, or steal to get a serious movie made within the comic book genre, that we were holding on to the glimpses that we had in 1990 with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie, and in 1995 with Mortal Kombat and things like that. These being the only, man, we even took the original Super Mario Brothers movie because we were just looking for something. And then 98 rolled around and Wesley Snipes played Blade and changed the game. And then 2000 hit and we got X-Men. And then 2002, 1, 2, Tobey Maguire plays Spider-Man and all of that sort of stuff. And then you fast forward to the Dark Knight trilogy, then you fast forward to the MCU and all of it. So, dude, the more the merrier. I'm always happy with a good like with a solid comic book story. I am not brand specific. And so I'm all for a plurality of things that look on the good side, on the optimistic side, that look from a hero-centric point of view, but I'm also willing to look at something from a darker point of view and look at how different cultures looked at spiritualism and the supernatural and all of this sort of stuff. Because just because it's not a point of view that I personally believe in, or I personally embrace, or I personally think is it, doesn't mean that I ignore it because a whole generation of people, or a whole culture, or a whole group believe in that, or had believed in that. And it would be narrow minded of me if I didn't experience the entirety of the world around me, even if I don't believe in it. Experiencing and accepting and believing are not the same thing. And we have to be aware of that. We have to be willing to accept the fact that just because we are taking something in doesn't mean that we are adopting it. And it doesn't mean that we are saying we put our stake in this. We are just watching a story or watching something play out or reading something that has different elements from different cultures. And that's where so Michael, to get back to Sinners, Michael B. Jordan plays twins in 1930s Mississippi, and it's a vampire flick. And it's this celebration of heritage and culture and spirituality and supernatural and and blues music. And the thing about this one though is it's horror as a lens for looking at the horrors of the world and looking at the horrors of colonization and looking at the horrors of racism and looking at the horrors of that humanity can bring on itself, all through again this lens of vampires. And but even the vampires are played by subjugated people in this. It's this idea overarching of unity and family and connection and things like that, even if some are offering a false or faux version of that. And it's this movie that is a somber, well told, realistic look at the Jim Crow South of the 30s. And it does so while telling a story that goes deeper than just racism, that goes into a story of that follows people who have been subjugated by other people and what it means to actually want to be free, what it means to actually experience freedom, and who deserves to be free, and what happens when you get freedom and things like that. And it's this big overarching idea and this big complex tapestry of different dynamics within this culture. And yes, there is a version, so like one of the ends, so spoilers for this movie, but there is a scene at the end of the movie where one of the twins that Michael B. Jordan plays is just you know unalives an entire crop of clans people, just one by one, just mows them down, because sometimes you just need a scene of somebody taking out an entire group of clans people. But there, so there is that portion of the conversation within this whole dynamic, but that's not the sum total of everything that happens in this movie. But you miss hearing different people's perspective and hearing from different people if you're unwilling to take in certain types of media just by virtue of the media. Now, on the flip side, I'll be the first one to admit, just like I did about Star Wars, not everything is real theologically sound, or not theologically sound. Well, yes, theologically sound, but philosophically sound. Star Trek, Star Trek has incredibly racist roots. It started in the 60s. The 60s were a very racist and misogynistic time. I'm not saying that we don't still deal with racism and misogyny, but like it's just there are plenty of horror stories from throughout the years, and some really gross depictions of different people groups and different things like that, and the whole nine yards. And then you have I talked about the Final Destination movies. Well, any one of those movies, y'all, uh I believe the term in horror circles is carnage candy. It is very, very carnage heavy. It is very, very violence heavy. It is the predecessor for what horror fans would go on to deem as torture porn. Different movies like Saw, stuff like that. That's kind of the evolved version of what was started in these movies, where they're big and grotesque death scenes that do not shy away from showing gore and things like that. And then this movie Sinners, this isn't made from a Christian point of view. And while Christianity is one of 6 different religious practices, spiritual practices, I guess is a better word rather than religious, that are depicted throughout this movie, there is not any one specific group or one specific one specific practice that it hangs its hat on and says, "Oh, this is the one." But it asks questions throughout every single solitary one of these different portrayals, and asks big questions throughout each and every one of them. Um, and so, and it's compelling, right? It's compelling to ask big questions about life, because we are humans and we like to ask big questions. But I think we also need to be willing to sit in the realities of the human existence through the lens of a safe medium to be able to address big topics. I think it's therapeutic to be able to do so, whether it's through fantasy, whether it's through horror, whether it's through sci-fi, whether it's through action, whether it's through through comics, through movies, through music, through whatever. That's the other half of that of Sinners. It is a celebration of blues, of blues music. And for those of you that don't know, I'm a blues musician. I love the blues. And I spent many a night just being real with y'all. After the sets were over, after we were done playing, sitting there with a bunch of old heads, listening to the stories about how they learned the blues from their grandparents, singing spiritual songs over a glass of whiskey, and learning about the culture and the history and the heritage of the craft that we all loved, that we were all there to do. And it is an honest look at where that came from, and the fact that it is an art form that is wildly appropriated by a variety of different groups. All you Christians that are watching, if you dig gospel music, I'm talking gospel. I'm not talking about Christian. I'm not talking about CCM. I'm talking about gospel. You can thank blues for that if you didn't know. That's where it comes from. And a lot of that you can thank the spiritual songs of the slaves for. It's where a lot of those old hymns came from. It's where a lot of the backbone of gospel comes from, is from there. But that's uncomfortable. That's uncomfortable to think about, that's where it came from. But you get to explore different periods of time through the safety of somebody on the screen, if you are willing to engage with a movie. Now, something like Sinners, to go through all of these different ones that Carnage can't, all these different things that are wrong with all these different things, there are wildly inappropriate sex scenes in these movies. Just being honest, just like it does not hold back, to a point where, as a film buff, as a cinephile, as somebody who has been watching movies since they were knee high to a grasshopper, I used to live down the street from the video rental place. We would be in there like every single day. I learned a lot about life growing up from movies and all of that sort of stuff. I won't go into all of the idiosyncrasies as far as my youth and being raised and all of that sort of stuff, but it is what it is. But I learned a lot of that from movies. and from experiencing those things. And so I even look at it and I'm like, yo, less is more sometimes. Like, just sometimes less is more. And but it's it's about looking at ethics. It's about looking at, as the thing says, what does it mean to be pure? And what does it mean to be a sinner? And so, but it's all within a complex structure. And I won't leave it off on something as somber as a vampire flick, right? But like, seriously, if you love the blues and if you're okay with it not being um an all ages film, go see Sinners, because it will give you a better idea of different belief structures. And if you love the blues, it is a celebration of the blues. It even has Buddy Guy in it. It is an awesome movie. I thought it was very, very powerful and an original concept. And so, on top of all of that, on top of all of these different all of these different themes and things like that, it just has a killer soundtrack. There's a post credit scene, "This Little Light of Mine," the lead character singing "This Little Light of Mine." I thought that was awesome. I could sit here and geek out about the history of blues because I love music that makes you feel a thing. And that's what it is, right? That's what I think I love about any one of these. So Star Wars, let me go back to Star Wars for a second. And I appreciate y'all. This is not the usual bag. I'm not sitting here talking high theology. I'm not sitting here talking about Bible. I'm not sitting here talking about reading the Bible and all of this sort of stuff, or teaching like I normally would. I'm trying to show you something. I am a pastor that is deeply passionate about showcasing the realities, the lived in realities of a relationship with God. And I challenge people on a regular basis to embrace the idea that we can sit here and go until we're blue in the face about theological this, about church this, about culture this, and all of this sort of stuff. And we can talk in circles about God, but we got to take 30 seconds and sit in awestruck wonder about the idea that this God that we keep talking about is a God that is bigger than we could wrap our minds around, loves us more than we can wrap our minds around, and is in relationship. The Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, the creator of everything. And I love all of that. My deepest desire is for more people to come into an intimate relationship with God, but that intimate relationship needs to sit in the complexities of the world, or else it falls apart. It has to be willing to stare the shades of gray dead in the face and not blink, not back down. Don't back down. Don't back down from the realities of human existence and the life that we live, and the world that we live in. And don't blink. Don't blink when you're asking big questions about life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. When you're asking big questions about determinism, when you're asking big questions about fate, when you're asking big questions about salvation or any of these other things, there has to be willing to look morality dead in the face and be willing to ask big questions, all of it from A to Z. But that's not what this one's about. This one's about looking at the things that we love and saying, yeah, okay, look at this. How about this one? Right? This is usually one that isn't on everybody's top 10 list and usually flies under the radar. For those of you that don't realize, that is Godzilla. And then I moved that, and it's kind of in the corner, shown a little bit. We got Batman, and we got the X-Men, and we got a pro wrestling belt, and we got all sorts of stuff going on here. Why? Because I am a raging nerd. Because I was a nerd before a nerd was cool, y'all. I remember when it was not the in vogue thing to go see a superhero flick. I remember those days. That's why I don't get caught up in the tribalism of DC movies versus Marvel movies and all of that kind of stuff. I'm like, yo, give me all of the comic book movies, because I remember, like I said, when we couldn't beg, borrow, or steal to get a decent comic book movie, decent superhero movie, decent video game adaptation, or any of those kinds of things, because they were looked down upon. They were looked at like you could not tell a compelling story in these mediums. And I hope the thing that you can wrap your mind around by hearing me go on about all of this stuff is nerd out about the things you love. Embrace the things that you love and use them as vehicles to be able to ask big questions, to be willing to interrogate the world that is around you, because it just might teach you something. It might just educate you on something. It might just smarten you up and give you a different point of view. And that's the beautiful thing about geek culture. That's the beautiful thing about nerding out. That's a beautiful thing about embracing these different mediums that we have. And so I'll round out, go into the whole superhero thing. Let's talk about the Big Blue Boy Scout, because he's getting a movie, and I put out a video, right? So again, thoughts from a bearded geek. It's where I put out video essays. I nerd out about geek culture stuff and all of this jazz, and I put out a video during couch era time when my leg was still busted and all of that, that we need, when the trailer dropped last year for the new James Gunn superhero or Superman movie, with that we need a new good Superman movie, because Superman gets a bad rap that he's truth, justice, in the American way. He hasn't been truth, justice, in the American way in a lot of years, not in decades at this point. That got dropped a long time ago, the third part. Now it's truth and justice and humanity. I forget what they replace, but it's basically truth and justice. It's more about the paragons, him being a paragon of humanity, more so than of the American way. And it's like anything, right? A lot of our favorite mediums that have been around for like almost 100 years, they have high points and low points. Marvel goes through the same thing with Captain America. Captain America was a World War II propaganda piece at one point in time, but so was the Big Blue Boy Scout. And so DC doesn't really have a whole lot of room to talk. And so, you look at Superman. Superman isn't just a superhero, he's a myth. Since his debut in 38, he stood as a cultural icon and a philosophical archetype, embodying ideals that stretch beyond comics into theology, ethics, and even metaphysics. He's not just the strongest man alive, he's a symbol of how to wield strength justly. At his core, Superman asks, what does it mean to be good when you could do anything? When you have the powers of a god, what does it mean to advocate for humanity? See, Superman operates less like a human struggling with morality, a la Batman, and more like a moral ideal. He is the modern he's the modern incarnation of Aristotelian virtue ethics, a character who's a being whose character reflects consistent habits of justice, courage, self-control, and compassion, raised by a simple farm family. And so Clark Kent reflects the power of nurture over nature. Being born with godlike powers, he's shaped by humility and kindness and a strong conscience and work ethic. And he does good because he can. He doesn't help people because he's forced to. He does it because it's right. He's good not out of fear or law, but from virtue. Superman explores how immense power must be tempered with immense restraint. And he goes through this arc of being both alien and deeply human, a duality that opens up rich philosophical questions about identity and belonging and otherness. He is the ultimate outsider, and then asks the question, what does it mean for someone to be human? Again, what makes somebody human? What makes somebody a recipient of respect and dignity? Superman is fundamentally a symbol of hope. It's the literal. It's literally the symbol on his chest. Now, because of his immense strength, because for those of you that don't know, he died in the 90s and was brought back to life. So, an all powerful figure who's a saving force that died and rose again. Where do you think all the comparisons sit? With Christ, right? Well, both of the original creators of Superman were Jewish. And so, in all actuality, he was created as a Moses figure, not a Christ figure. He was supposed to be a paragon of leading people out of subjugation and darkness and into a brighter day. Now, if you get into the theological deep weeds, Moses is a type and shadow of Jesus. And so there's going to be overlap into what that looks like and how that plays out. But the reality is he is an archetype of a Moses figure. And honestly, when you look at a superhero like that, he's more than just a superhero. He's a moral thought experiment. He's not interesting because of what he can do, but because of what he chooses to do. His strength is second to his self-control. His origin is alien in nature, and his purpose is deeply human. In a world that's fascinated by anti-heroes and moral ambiguity, Superman remains a challenge. What if the strongest person alive was also the most good? And in asking that, he invites us to answer, what will we do with power we already have? How will we wield the power that we have? And so any one of these franchises that we talked about tonight asks big questions, swings for the fences, and we could go down the pike. Drop them in the chat. You want to do one? Let's do one. Let's go ahead and hit one and hit how any one of these characters can ask big questions and can invite us into a posture of exploring deep and rich and thematic examples of the human experience. So, why not do that as a Christian? Because you take God with you wherever you go. So why not ask big questions with God by your side? That's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying. And even if you're not going to dive into the realm of horror and do that, you can still do everything that I'm talking about through the lens of superheroes, through the lens of fantasy, and everything in between. That's the beauty of it, y'all. That's the beauty of imagination. That's the beauty of storytelling. That's the beauty of allowing yourself the freedom to be able to interrogate life as if God isn't going to be angry at you by doing so. So, that's it. That's all. That's a wrap. I hope you all enjoyed this. A different look into a different side of me, a different side of my personality, a different side of what I enjoy and love. And one of the things that brings so much life to me is stories of these different stories that force us to reflect on the world around us and the truth and reality of the world around us. And that's the beauty of engaging with culture in a way that isn't fearful. You're not going to catch the sin. You're not going to catch the devil. You're not going to fall in backwards into worshiping something or catch some curse or anything else like that. Because the truth is that's not how that works. And so, as we as we go our different ways, I invite you all explore different IPs, explore different stories, and be adventurous. Allow yourself the freedom because you just might enjoy yourself, because you just might find something that shows you a different point of view on life. All right. Until next time, peace.